hosting us here today, and acknowledge that we're on the territory of the Coast and Strait Salish people. Thank them for hosting us as always for all these years and all the good things they do for us and sharing that they do for us here at IGOV. I want to welcome you to our speaker series. It's the second event in the IGOV Speaker Series. The first one was Winona Victor a couple weeks ago, a Coast Salish woman who's doing her PhD in criminology on Coast Salish women's leadership. Today we have Glen Coulthard, who you're all here to see. And I just want to take the opportunity while you're all here to tell you about our next one as well. Our next one is Dr. Audra Simpson, a good friend of ours, who's a Mohawk anthropologist at Columbia University, will be presenting on the oddly titled concept of Mohawk interrupters. Isn't that enough reason to come? Okay, I want to find out what that title's all about myself, so I think you guys should come and check that one out. And we have a flyer with the date, and I can't remember the date right now. November 7th at 5 p.m. So November 7th at 5 p.m. So remember that, and if you can, appreciate you coming up with that one as well. Thank you all for being here today. I'm not going to say too much because you're obviously all here to listen to Dr. Coulthard talk about raging against empire. I will just introduce him because I have the opportunity here today to claim him as an IGOV graduate. He has his master's degree from IGOV. There's always a little bit of competition between the Department of Political Science and IGOV as to who Glen belongs to. He got his PhD here at the University of Victoria in political science as well, so he has a very strong connection to UVic. And very, very proud to have him here and to have him as a graduate of the program. He's one of the leading young scholars out there, period. I don't need to say anything more than that, but in the field that we work in, he's really set a new standard for taking the work of Fanon and that tradition and taking the Indigenous work that we do and taking it up a level. So very proud and a lot of respect to have for Glen and the work that he's doing. The talk that he's going to do today, as it's advertised, is Rage Against Empire. And that's from his new book, which I seem to have a problem remembering the title. So I'll just ask him to say the title.
Subjects of Empire, Indigenous Peoples and Recognition Politics.
Coming out in 2013. And so we already have it on our course syllabi in draft form. And so keep your eyes open for that. And with that, I just want to introduce Dr. Coulthard, and because I know that he has a lot to say and you'll probably have a lot of questions. And we probably won't have enough time, and so I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to Glen.
Must show time for that nice introduction. It's always an honor for me to come back here to visit. Like my development here as a scholar and student was really formative experience in my life, so it's an honor to be back here on Coast and Strait Salish territory. So today I'm going to talk to you about the kind of last part of this book project that I've been working on, which started here, I guess, about almost 10 years ago, under the supervision of first Dr. Alfred, and then with increasing guidance by Professor Jim Tully. Doing my PhD here. So it's on a kind of a combination of a critique that I've been developing using Indigenous and anti-colonial thought on this turn to recognition and reconciliation politics as a means of fixing the relationship between Indigenous peoples and settlers and the settler state in Canada. So I'll just start. I should also mention that I gave some thought as to, I tend to work off of a paper, so forgive me for that. So when I was out for dinner with Rita DeMoon last night, she said that I should add a bit more, but I'm not going to. Yeah, you're welcome. So on June 11, 2008, the Conservative Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper, issued an official apology on behalf of the Government of Canada to Indigenous survivors of the Indian residential school system. Characterizes the inauguration of what he called a new chapter in the history of Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal relationships in the country. The residential school policy was a highly anticipated and emotionally charged event. Across the country, Native and non-Native people alike gathered in living rooms, churches, community halls, and First Nation band offices to witness and pay homage to this, what was touted as a historic occasion. Although there was a great deal of Native skepticism towards the apology in the days leading up to it, mainly dealing with non-transparency of what would be in the content and non-consultation, or little consultation. In its immediate aftermath, it appeared that many, if not most, observers felt that Harper's apology was a genuine and necessary first step on the long road to forgiveness and reconciliation. Now, since the 1980s, a global industry has emerged promoting the issuing of official apologies, advocating forgiveness and reconciliation as an important precondition for resolving the adverse social impacts of intrastate violence, mass atrocity, and historical injustice. Originally, the reconciliation industry was developed in state contexts which sought to undergo a formal transition from the violent history of openly authoritarian regimes to more democratic forms of rule, known in the literature as transitional justice. But more recently, it's been imported by somewhat stable, liberal democratic settler states like Australia and Canada. In Canada, we have witnessed this relatively recent reconciliation politics converge with a slightly older politics of recognition, which advocates the institutional recognition and accommodation of Indigenous cultural difference as a means of reconciling the colonial relationship between Indigenous peoples and the state. So political theorist Andrew Schaap explains the convergence of these two discourses well, and I'll just quote him briefly. In societies divided by a history of political violence, political reconciliation depends on transforming a relationship of enmity into one of civic friendship. In such contexts, a discourse of recognition provides a ready frame in which reconciliation might be conceived. Now in Canada, reconciliation tends to be invoked, this is me again, three distinct yet interrelated ways when deployed in the context of Indigenous peoples' struggle for self-determination. First, reconciliation is frequently used to refer to the diversity of individual and/or collective practices that Indigenous peoples undertake to establish a healthier relation to self in situations where this relationship has been torn apart or distorted by some form of symbolic or structural violence. Being afforded recognition or due recognition by another subject or subjects is often said to play a fundamental role in facilitating this form of reconciliation. In community contexts, this notion of reconciliation is often expressed by Indigenous peoples in the language of healing. Second, reconciliation is also commonly referred to as the act of restoring estranged or damaged social and political relationships. It is frequently inferred by proponents of reconciliation that restoring these relationships requires that individuals and groups work to overcome the debilitating pain and resentment that frequently persists in the wake of being injured or harmed by a perceived or real injustice. In settler state contexts, truth and reconciliation commissions, coupled with state arrangements that seek to recognize and accommodate Indigenous identity-related differences, are viewed as an important institutional means to facilitate reconciliation in both these first two senses. These institutional mechanisms are also seen as a crucial way to avoid the cycles of violence and revenge that can occur when societal cultural differences are openly suppressed or ignored, and when so-called negative emotions, such as anger and resentment, are left to fester within and between social groups. The third notion of reconciliation, commonly invoked in the Canadian context, refers to the process by which things are brought to, quote, agreement, concord, or harmony, the fact of being made consistent or compatible. And this is to quote the Oxford English Dictionary's, one of its definitions of reconciliation. As Anishinaabe political philosopher Dale Turner's recent work demonstrates, this third form of reconciliation the act of rendering things consistent, is the one that lies at the core of Canada's approach to reconciliation. That is, rendering consistent Indigenous assertions of nationhood with the state's own unilateral assertion of sovereignty over our lands and territories, and people, sorry. I argue that it's the state's attempt to impose this third meaning of reconciliation through its institutional approach that is effectively undermining the first two meanings of the term. So it's the imposition of this attempt to render consistent Indigenous assertions of nationhood with state sovereignty that is rendering or making the other two forms of reconciliation impossible. So Thomas Broodholm's recent book, Resentment's Virtue, Jean Emery and the Refusal to Forgive, offers, to my mind, an important critique of the turn to reconciliation politics that has emerged globally over the last 30 years. Broodholm's study provides a much-needed counterpoint to what he calls the near-hegemonic status afforded the logic of forgiveness in the literatures on transitional justice and reconciliation. Focusing on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa, Broodholm shows how advocates of transitional justice often base their normative assumptions about the desirability of forgiveness and reconciliation on a number of uncritical assumptions about the perils associated with so-called, or harboring so-called reactive emotions like anger and resentment. Notably that these feelings are physically and mentally unhealthy, irrational, retrograde, and when collectively expressed, prone to producing increased social instability, and political violence. Broodholm challenges these assumptions through a fascinating engagement with the writing of essayist and Holocaust survivor Jean Emery, whose work challenges the hegemonic portrayal of resentment or ressentiment as a vengeful, reactionary, and backward-looking mode of being forcefully developed by Friedrich Nietzsche and on the genealogy of morals. In much of Nietzsche's work, ressentiment, or I'll just use resentment, is cast as an irredeemably poisonous, festering, and impotent mode of being. Resentment is a pathologically other-determined orientation to the world, which for Nietzsche signifies the abnegation of freedom as self-valorizing, life-affirming action. According to Broodholm, the importance of Emery's work is that it forces us to consider that under certain conditions, a disciplined maintenance of outrage and resentment in the wake of historical injustice can signify a, quote, reflex expression of moral protest that is as permissible and admirable as a posture of forgiveness. In my presentation, I undertake a similar line of argumentation, although with two significant differences. First, as a critique of the field and practice of transitional justice, Broodholm's study is limited to the, quote, aftermath of mass atrocities and to the, quote, time after the violence has been brought to an end. In my book, the political import of Indigenous peoples' emotional responses to colonialism is instead explored against the non-transitional backdrop of the state's approach to reconciliation that began to emerge slowly after 1969 and then accelerate following the report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996. When understood in this manner, those who refuse refuse to forgive and or reconcile are typically cast as being saddled by the unhappy or unhealthy psychological aftermath of this legacy, of which anger and resentment are frequently identified. The second difference that, from Broodholm's work is that I use the work of Frantz Fanon instead of that of Jean Emery. I suggest that Fanon held a very nuanced perspective on both the positive and the negative aspects of colonized people's anger, envy, and resentment when expressed within and against the psychological and structural features of colonial power. In suggesting this, however, I do not deny the possibility that these at times hostile emotions can manifest themselves in disempowering ways. Rather, my position can be broken down into the following two claims. First, even when seemingly problematic expressions of Indigenous anger and resentment appear to emerge, they may nonetheless represent an entirely understandable and legitimate response to a settler colonial present that still violently structures our lives, our relationships with others, and our relationships to the land. Hypothetically, even if our anger and resentment is expressed in the most self-destructive manner possible, this does not take away from the fact that these emotions have a logic to them, a rationality insofar as they identify an ongoing, persistent harm in the world, even if the character of this harm has yet to fully disclose itself to us. Now, my second claim is that instead of simply legitimizing what is still represented above, or so far as an understandable, yet ultimately unhealthy reaction to colonialism, I want to argue that under certain circumstances, proactively embracing our individual and collective resentment can play a cathartic, transformative role in prompting the very forms of self-affirmative action that reproduce or produce rehabilitated Indigenous subjectivities and decolonized forms of life. Decolonized forms of life that the combined politics of recognition and reconciliation has proven itself structurally and subjectively incapable of doing in Canada. So now, that this rather lengthy sort of kind of sketch of my argument is out of the way, I want to kind of turn to this question of recognition and critique its relationship or perceived relationship with reconciliation. Because in order to eventually kind of unpack the meaning of Indigenous people's emotional responses to colonialism, we first have to understand recognition and what it's doing or not doing in Canada. Rather than transforming the colonial relationship in any significant sense, I argue that the rise to dominance of a recognition-based approach to reconciliation, following the publication and eventual shelving of the so-called Canada's so-called white paper on Indian policy, has simply prompted a shift in Canada about how settler colonialism and its power operate in Canada. In the 2 centuries leading to this historic policy proposal, which, as we should all know, called for the blanket assimilation of status Indian population by unilaterally removing all aspects of legal and political difference that distinguishes First Nations from non-Canadians under the Indian Act. Prior to this, the reproduction of the colonial relationship between Indigenous peoples and the state depended heavily on the deployment of power that was geared towards the genocidal exclusion and assimilation of our peoples. Any honest examination of the character of colonial Indian policy during this period will attest to this fact. For instance, this era witnessed Canada's repeated attempts to uproot and destroy the vitality and autonomy of Indigenous modes of life through institutions such as residential schools, through the imposition of settler state policies aimed at explicitly undercutting Indigenous political economies and relationships to and with land, through the violent dispossession of First Nations women's rights to land and community membership under sexist provisions of the Indian Act, through the theft of Aboriginal children via child welfare policies, which, as we all now know, the amount of Indigenous children apprehended through child welfare has surpassed the amount that originally were apprehended through the residential school policies for 100 years. Through the whole, of course, the whole near wholesale dispossession of Indigenous peoples' lands and territories and traditional modes of government in exchange for delegated administered powers to be exercised over relatively minuscule reserve lands. All of these policies sought to marginalize our communities with the ultimate goal being our elimination. If not physically, then at least as cultural, political, and legal peoples distinguishable from the rest of Canadian society. These initiatives reflect the more or less unconcealed, unilateral, and coercive nature of colonial rule during most of the 19th and 20th centuries. Now, although Indigenous peoples have always collectively and individually resisted these policies and practices, it wasn't until the turbulent climate of red power activism in the 1960s and 70s that policies towards the recognition and so-called reconciliation of native land and political grievances with state sovereignty began to appear. There are roughly three, I think, significant events in Canadian history which prompted this shift in policy. The first was the materialization of widespread Indigenous, or First Nations in particular, outrage and opposition to the 1969 White Paper. Although the White Paper was designed as a once-and-for-all solution to Canada's Indian policy and was supposed to serve as a legal kind of conduit towards our passive assimilation, it actually served as a catalyst around which Indigenous nationalisms begin to crop up and grow. The sheer magnitude of First Nations unified resistance to the White Paper forced the federal government to back off and formally shelve the document in 1971. The second event occurred in the wake of the Supreme Court of Canada's 1973 Coulthard decision. This landmark case involved a claim launched by Nisga'a hereditary chief Frank Coulthard to the unextinguished territories of his nation in northwestern British Columbia. The case essentially turned over a 75-year precedent first established in St. Catharines Milling and Lumber versus the Queen in 1888, which stated that Aboriginal rights existed only to the extent and insofar as Canada recognized them as existing. Aboriginal rights in this view were contingent and dependent entirely on the supposed goodwill of the Crown. Now, although technically a defeat for the Nisga'a, the specific character of the Supreme Court's ruling in Coulthard left enough uncertainty surrounding the existence of Aboriginal land rights that it prompted a shift and the eventual inauguration of Canada's comprehensive land claim strategy in 1973. This strategy essentially reversed 52 years since the signing of 1921 of Treaty 11 with the Satu Dene and the Northwest Territories of the state's refusal to recognize Indigenous claims to land where the question of existing Aboriginal title still remained uncertain. Now, the third event, or rather kind of cluster of events, emerged following the turbulent decade of energy politics in the 1970s. This crisis subsequently fueled an aggressive push by state and industry to develop what it saw as the largely untapped resource potential of northern Canada. The proposed increase in northern non-renewable resource development during this time was envisioned despite concerns raised by the Métis, Dene, and Inuit of the Northwest Territories regarding Canada's proposal to sanction the development of a huge natural gas pipeline to pump natural gas from the Arctic Ocean down through northern Alberta. This was our land, and we vehemently opposed this, and our subsequent political campaigns forced this agenda into the living rooms of common Canadians in the South, and kind of forced along with it the idea of Aboriginal rights, and in particular rights to land. This was simultaneously going on while the James Bay Cree were resisting an equally mega project, hydroelectric this time, on their territory in the James Bay region. They were also very politically savvy in getting their message on and in the living rooms of common Canadians regarding their rights to that territory and protecting that territory. So it is my contention then that colonial rule underwent a profound shift in the wake of these events. More specifically, I argue that the expression of Indigenous anti-colonial nationalism that emerged during this period, or emerged more publicly during this period, forced settler colonial power to modify itself from a structure that was once primarily reinforced by policies, techniques, and ideologies explicitly framed around the genocidal exclusion and assimilation model, to one that is now reproduced through a seemingly more conciliatory set of languages and discourses and institutional practices which now emphasize our recognition and our accommodation. Regardless of this modification, however, the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the state has remained fundamentally colonial to its core. Now, I think that the last 30 years of Aboriginal rights jurisprudence in Canada provides an illuminating example of this, and this is just one example of many, unfortunately. During this period, the Supreme Court of Canada has consistently refused to recognize our status as equal and self-determining nations based on the court's adherence to precedent founded on the white supremacist myth that Indigenous societies were too savage or primitive to bear fundamental political rights worth recognizing when we first encountered Europeans on our lands. I say myth not only because it was based on an empirically incorrect assessment of Indigenous cultures and societies, but because it was arrived at through a retrospective revision of historical fact. The fact being that for at least the first 3 centuries of non-Indigenous presence on this continent, Indigenous people's sovereign, political, economic, and military authority was a force that Europeans ignored at their peril. The notion of reconciliation advanced by the Supreme Court of Canada is entirely dependent on this racist refusal of recognition. This is the most evident in the Supreme Court's interpretation of the scope and content of those Aboriginal rights recognized in Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution in 1982. As it states in Arvers and Vanderpeet in 1996, and I'll quote the Supreme Court here, the substantive rights that fall within the Constitution must be defined in light of this purpose. The Aboriginal rights recognized and affirmed by Section 35(1) must be directed towards reconciliation of the pre-existence of Aboriginal societies with the sovereignty of the Crown. So reconciliation in the third sense of rendering two things consistent. How might we ask, does the court propose to reconcile the pre-existence of Aboriginal societies with the sovereignty of Canada? By refusing that the Aboriginal societies in question had anything akin to sovereignty worth recognizing to begin with. Instead, what the court offers up is an interpretation of Aboriginal rights as narrowly construed cultural rights that can be infringed on by the state for any number of legislative reasons, ranging from conservation to settlement to non-renewable resource development, and even to protect white interests against the potential economic fallout from recognizing Aboriginal rights to land and land-based economic pursuits. This provides a clear demonstration in my mind that colonial power will only recognize the collective rights and identities of Indigenous peoples insofar as this recognition does not throw into question the background, racial, legal, political, and economic framework of the colonial relationship itself. So much with recognition. Now on to reconciliation and resentment. So now I want to turn to the two claims that I initially started this presentation with. That is, given that the failure of recognition, the utter failure of recognition to deliver on its emancipatory promise of reconciliation, I suggest that what Nietzsche refers to scornfully as ressentiment or resentment is both an appropriate and legitimate response to settler colonization, and that under certain circumstances, maintaining a disciplined hold on our resentment can prompt the forms of self-affirmative practice that produce decolonized forms of life in the ways in which the recognition and reconciliation approach has utterly failed to do. So taken together, I suggest that these two claims connect with two problematic assumptions that have come to animate how we think about emotions like resentment, as well as many contemporary arguments that support state approaches to reconciliation in Canada. So in common usage, resentment is usually referenced negatively to indicate a feeling closely associated with that of anger. However, I argue that where one can be angry with any number of things, resentment is typically reserved for and directed against instances of perceived wrongdoing. The Oxford Dictionary of English, for example, defines resentment as a feeling of bitter indignation at having been treated unfairly. When seen from this angle, resentment appears to have an inbuilt political component to it, given that it is often expressed in response to alleged slight, an instance of maltreatment, or even injustice. The implicit political referent underwriting expressions of resentment has not gone unnoticed either within the Western philosophical tradition. Philosophers such as Adam Smith, John Rawls, Robert Sullivan, and Thomas Broodholm have written extensively on the moral significance of emotions like resentment. Broodholm notes that although these theorists may vary regarding the, quote, conditions and circumstances under which anger or resentment is appropriate, they nonetheless all draw an important distinction between excessive and pathological forms on the one hand and appropriate and valuable forms on the other. It's the first time I've ever used John Rawls' affirmative. I won't do it again. Approaches to transitional justice and reconciliation, however, rarely treat reactive emotions like anger and resentment in this even-handed manner. Rather, when juxtaposed with reconciliation, resentment is more likely to be represented in a manner similar to Nietzsche's characterization of ressentiment in the genealogy of morals. There, resentment is also cast as a human emotion with profound political implications, although for Nietzsche these implications are anything but redeeming. Resentment is instead portrayed as a life-stultifying and retrograde mode of existence that is entirely negative and reactive. The first assumption I want to challenge here then relates to how these common perspectives characterize resentment as a hopelessly backward-looking state. Resentment, in other words, is often cast as a pathological inability to come to grips with history. And thus spoke Zarathustra, for example. Nietzsche describes resentment as an expression of one's, quote, powerlessness against that which has been. Resentment indicates a failure to, quote, let go, or in Nietzsche's terms, to willfully forget. To be saddled with resentment is to be obsessively preoccupied with offenses suffered in the past. Resentment nails the victim to the past, writes Thomas Broodholm. It blocks the exit to the future and twists or disorders the time sense of the person trapped within it. Those familiar with the reconciliation paradigm in Canada should immediately see the similarities here. All one needs to do is recall Prime Minister Harper's so-called apology to those who suffered the attempted genocide of the Indian residential school system. By focusing narrowly on the tragedy of residential schools, Harper's apology is able to temporally frame reconciliation in terms of overcoming a, quote, sad chapter in our shared history together. It is a way of transcending the, quote, painful legacy that has hampered our collective movements or our collective efforts to move on. Reconciliation is necessary to, quote, begin anew so that Indigenous peoples can start to build, quote, new partnerships together with non-Indigenous peoples in what is now unproblematically and unapologetically declared by Harper to be our land. The problem with this formulation, of course, oh, there's lots of problems, is that insofar as Harper's apology even implicitly addresses the question of settler colonialism, it does so, to paraphrase anthropologist Patrick Wolfe, as an event and not a structure. That is, an historical phenomenon which occurred at some point in the distant past, but which unfortunately continues to have negative consequences for Indigenous peoples in the present. This is what happens when the conceptual and institutional tools of transitional justice are applied to the non-transitional setting of settler colonies, where there is no period marking a clear or formal transition from an authoritarian past to a democratic present. State-sanctioned approaches to reconciliation must ideologically manufacture such a transition by allocating the abuses associated with colonization to the dustbins of history. By definition, however, there is nothing historical in the sense of being of the past about settler colonial rule. Settlers have come, and they have come to stay. Settler colonialism is a relationship that is constituted by ongoing domination, one where interrelated facets of discursive and non-discursive power have been structured into a relatively secure and immobile set of unequal relationships that continue to facilitate the dispossession of Indigenous peoples of our lands and of our governing authority. In this respect, Canada is no different than any other settler colonial power. In the Canadian context, colonial domination continues to be structurally committed to maintain, through force, fraud, and more recently so-called negotiations, ongoing state access to the land and resources that contradictorily provide the spiritual sustenance of Indigenous societies on the one hand, as well as our material sustenance, and the foundation of colonial state formation, settlement, and capitalist development on the other. In such context, I suggest that the harbor resentment, that is an intense feeling of bitter indignation towards a harm or wrongdoing, is not only an entirely defendable position, but it's an actual sign of our critical consciousness, of our sense of justice and injustice, and of our awareness of and unwillingness to reconcile ourselves with the structural and symbolic violence that is still very much a part of our lives. Now, the second assumption I want to critically interrogate relates more specifically to Nietzsche's characterization of resentment as an entirely reactive as opposed to active mode of existence. According to Nietzsche, one of the most perverse features of what he calls the, quote, man of ressentiment is that in order to exist at all, he first needs a, quote, hostile external world. That is, his very identity depends, writes Nietzsche, on, quote, external stimuli in order to act at all. His action is fundamentally reaction. It is this subject-forming reactive positioning to settler colonialism that Tyagi Alfred and Jeff Horntassel identify when they warn of the, quote, danger in allowing colonization to be the only story in Indigenous lives, where colonial power becomes the, quote, fundamental reference and assumption against which Indigenous subjectivities are constructed and our conceptions of freedom understood. Now, on this last point, I have once again garnered much insight from the work of Frantz Fanon. Rather than hopelessly fixating one's actions on attaining a conciliatory form of recognition by the colonial state and society, Fanon instead argues that self-determination instead manifests as a form of personal and collective self-affirmation. Rather than remaining dependent on the actions of our colonial masters for our freedom and self-worth, on a hostile external world, to again invoke Nietzsche's terminology, Fanon recognized that the colonized must instead struggle to overcome their own subjection, alienation, self-hatred, and so on, against the racist gaze of colonial state recognition. It is this self-generative critical practice that triggers a change of fundamental importance in the colonized, quote, psycho-affective equilibrium. According to this view, the colonized must engage decolonization by first recognizing ourselves as free, dignified, and distinct contributors to humanity. According to Fanon, the native must begin to turn away from their master dependency and to instead struggle for freedom on our own terms and in accordance with our own values. Unlike Nietzsche, however, I suggest that Fanon saw resentment as having a critically transformative role to play in inaugurating this newfound radical, decolonized subjectivity and practice. Throughout The Wretched of the Earth, for example, Fanon repeatedly speaks of the colonized subject's anger, envy, and resentment toward the colonizers in near cathartic terms. In other words, Fanon, these emotional expressions represent the initial stage of the colonized subjects coming to consciousness, of the purging of their internalized colonial racism through the externalization of an enemy, the colonist. Resentment, anger, rage, and even the desire for revenge motivate the colonized to struggle for land and freedom. They help jolt the colonized into what Fanon calls, now speaking directly in response to Nietzsche, an actional existence as opposed to a reactional one, characterized by the form of resentment that Nietzsche found so disconcerting. And in the best case scenarios, Fanon saw these negative emotions of having the power to prompt the very forms of Indigenous praxis that are required to break out of the Minikin binary of our colonial situation, by uprooting the structural colonial injustices that produce resenting colonized subjects in the first place. It is because the slow-burning, unrelenting sting of outrage and resentment, it's because of this, not despite of this, that we as Indigenous peoples get this important work done. Merci, Joe. I'm not sure how much time, but all and any questions are welcome.
I don't know if this would be maybe your next book that you would talk about.
I'm not ever writing a book again.
Okay. Never mind, I'll accept the short answer then. I completely agree with everything you just said about asserting your own freedom and your own territory, and as anger being a catalyst, as I'm hearing you describe it, to take action. My question is around sustainability in direct action. Once you've gotten to the place of reclaiming identity and sovereignty, how do you feel, or can you talk a little bit about anger or resentment as like a sustainable motivator?
Yeah, I can, because, well, I can talk about it in relationship to what Fanon says. And Fanon almost explicitly says that it can't sustain a war of liberation. It has to transform itself into these kind of affirmative sorts of practices. But I think that insofar as the injustice itself hasn't succeeded, then that anger and resentment will often, if not kind of act as a potential motivator, it will at least be some sort of critical sign that something hasn't been fixed. So instead of getting too prescriptive on it, I actually go back, or I would ask us to go back and look at the forms of outrage and resentment that prompted the turn to reconciliation to begin with in 1996. So in 1996, you have two things that are generally recognized as kind of indicating that there's a major malfunction in the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the state. That was the failure of Meech Lake Accord, and then more importantly, the so-called Oka crisis. Now, those were the two that were examined in the context, or understood to be kind of what needed to be contained. But if you look at the types of practices that Indigenous communities were undertaking in the decade after obtaining recognition in the Constitution to 1996, you see like the Innu direct action against NATO bombing on their territory, the struggles of the Lubicon Cree for their territory, the shutdown of the BC province by First Nations for multiple acts of defiance and blockading throughout the 1980s and 90s. And all of these sorts of kind of alternative, the construction of alternative ways of being and articulations of Indigenous ethics and resistance. This is what reconciliation actually emerged to contain, was the uncertainty that was being generated and spilling over into these Indigenous self-affirmative forms of direct action and defense of their rights. So I think we just have to kind of go look at, in a kind of, or participate in these forms of activity as a means of kind of channeling that rage and resentment into actual activity.
Hi, thank you. I'm a visitor to this territory. I am from Western Newfoundland. I'm a member of the new First Nation that's just been created last year. I don't know if you're aware of it, but the Qalipu First Nation is a Mi'kmaq nation that recognizes the Indigenous in Newfoundland for 10,000 years, but principally since 1949, when there was no recognition when Newfoundland joined Canada. So for me, I'm coming to grips with the reality that I'm an Indigenous man. There was an awful lot of suppression of Indigenous identity in Western Newfoundland for reasons of rampant discrimination. People could not work if they were Indian. This is a very diverse group of people, who, many of whom have some sort of Indigenous identity. Can I ask you to speak to the question of identity, what it means to be Indigenous? I'd be grateful for your words on that.
Well, I can speak to it from what I've come to understand as an Indigenous, but more specifically a Dene person who's grown up for a significant amount of time in the city. And I can speak to what was expressed as a profound, or felt, experienced as a profound lack of what was missing in myself while growing up in like the racist context of Kelowna, or traveling to major urban centers in order to pursue an education. And that was a connection to an embeddedness in the social relationships of place of my territory. Over the last few years, I have made a conscious effort to re-embed and learn from those social relationships and apply it to my work, to my life, and to what I do. So I would just speak to the importance of those relations of recognition and social relations as being the forms of Indigenous empowerment that are important, and not so much whether or not we are being recognized by the state or through the constraint mechanisms of the law, and so on and so forth. So it is those alternative relations of recognition in between ourselves, our communities, our families, and our land, which are the ones that are important for keeping us grounded, strong, and healthy. Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, actually the framework of that in the context of what you're talking about. And I'm wondering if you could comment on whether or not a state commission can actually ever really reach truth, and if so, how would that occur? And also, if you could talk a little bit more about where reconciliation separates from assimilation, and particularly in that process, how you see that in that particular context?
Yeah, so the first question on whether or not it can kind of produce some sort of emancipatory or like self-determining effects, I don't think that it's just structurally not created to do that. I think that these things emerge to contain and placate sort of the simmering, overbubbling of resentment and anger that was explosive in terms of disrupting or rendering uncertain Canada's assertion of sovereignty over Indigenous peoples and lands, and the economic certainty required for settlement and capitalist development. So that's what the reconciliation industry was implemented to do, under the banner that something was wrong and we're all unhealthy and angry at this. So there needs to be something done. Now, I think it's important to refer back to kind of the three notions of reconciliation that I kind of opened with, and that's reconciliation as kind of the individual and collective practices that Indigenous peoples undergo to heal, to become healthy again, become whole again. And then the reconciliation of the relationship between non-Indigenous and Indigenous peoples. Now, I think if there's anything that can happen in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it's going to perhaps come in the form of the first instance. There might be, through these gatherings, some sort of cathartic, collective attempt to deal with what's happened to us, but also continuing to happen to us. I don't think it's very hopeful in an attempt to structure the relationship between non-Indigenous peoples, mostly because non-Indigenous peoples don't show up for these things. They get to hear about it through rumor, maybe sometimes through the news, although I don't even think I've seen anything on the news about it. And that's kind of one of its deep-seated structural limitations. And then Canada's approach isn't about fixing Indigenous peoples, or is it about fixing the relationship? It's consistently maintained its commitment to the third approach, which is rendering consistent our presence with its final radical assertion of sovereignty over our territories and our people. That's really kind of screwing up any sort of effectiveness, or undermines the effectiveness of reconciliation in the first two sentences instances. So I don't have much, I don't think it's designed to do it, so we have to think of other approaches. I can't remember your second.
Just, I think you answered it really, but just in that context where reconciliation is really assimilation.
Yeah, as it's presently constructed through the state institutions, it is, I think. Or evidence points in that direction. Forgot this side.
So, can you perhaps speak a little bit about how perhaps reconciliation, is it something that's new? I think for a lot of Canadians, reconciliation is something that is new. Is it been around in Canada, initiated by different perhaps groups, Indigenous nations themselves, in your mind?
Yeah, I guess you could think of it in long-standing traditions of treaty making, like especially reconciliation between conflicting nations or communities. It's been around longer than the 1990s. My point of coupling approach, like recognizing cultural diversity, was thinly veiled, or at least expressed an intent to reconcile both the harms of mis- or non-recognition in a racist society, but also the conflict between competing communities. So it's been around a while. Like I think another emphasis would be to work with, or look at the work that was Jeff's doing on community-based approaches to reconciliation, which start by kind of not abandoning entirely, but like we're not going to become whole again or grounded again or healthy or rebuild our nations by gaining recognition from the state and society, but about doing these through self-generated direct action and practice with our own communities. So, and I think that's, and whenever there has been a conflict that there's long-standing Indigenous traditions that we can learn from that promote reconciliation in a more authentic sense.
Forgive me if this doesn't make sense. I just thought of it as we were talking. So Fanon asserts that decolonization is a humanization of both the colonizer and the colonized. And as you point out, resentment can be a motivating force in decolonial struggles for Indigenous peoples. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on the role of resentment, this time of settlers towards Indigenous claims, as a contributing force for decolonial struggles.
As a contributing force for decolonial struggles?
If I could maybe expand on that. I think the resentment that often manifests in racism, at the very least, can sort of expose the colonial structure. But also, if, as a settler, you're looking at it logically, or trying to look at it logically, resentment then by settlers can only be cured by elimination, which is a morally indefensible position, or you can just have decolonization.
Yeah, no, that's an important question, because the affirmation of resentment that I am speaking to here is righteous, or the resentment of settlers because Indigenous peoples are perceived to be making claims or undermining their own sense of self or legitimacy on this territory isn't righteous. That's a pathological form. What to do with that, though, is a good question, and because it can double up like that. Indigenous expressions are calling out in their outrage of these injustices can prompt a kind of like a defensive backtracking and entrenchment of settler resentment. And that is something strategically that Indigenous peoples have to kind of keep on their mind, but it is also not our responsibility to work over your problems. But this, I guess, probably just indicates, and this is just a sloppy answer, that this is going to have to be done in relationships of solidarity with other justice-minded, non-Indigenous folks in a large sort of, in a collective undertaking. I think that like the turning away kind of thesis does not, or is not meant to indicate that. It's just indicating the sites in which we're more likely to foster an authentic, better relationship are going to occur in some places more than they are going to occur in others, like in government relationships through the state, mediated through the institutions of capitalism, are places where they're not going to happen, but they can happen on the ground at the barricade. In these sorts of grassroots contexts.
Thank you very much for your talk. I think good, and I think you're absolutely right in terms of your critique of the reconciliation process. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your Nietzsche discussing this morning. And what you think about, because there is a sort of strand within Nietzsche studies that would say that resentment and ressentiment aren't synonymous with one another, and that distinction you make between a kind of healthy versus pathological resentment is very much representation that he, is perfectly supportive of sort of emotions of anger, hatred, guilt, revenge, even resentment, when related to concrete injustices that have been experienced, and when linked up to kind of an active project of assertion of values. And that for him, resentment only becomes the sentiment, it becomes something pacifier, it becomes reaction when it stops you from engaging in asserting your values.
Yeah. No, and these things are unresolved in Nietzsche studies. So I take my cues from people in particular like Robert Solomon, while recognizing that these debates are ongoing. And it's not really about Nietzsche, but like a post-Nietzschean sort of interpretation of the harms of resentment that I'm focusing on, which I think are there in Nietzsche, and especially when Nietzsche talks about the political manifestations of resentment that he thinks are so problematic or just steeped in slave morality. So like anarchism, like revolutionaries, all these people are degraded as being men of ressentiment in ways that I think that we ought to be affirming.
What are your thoughts on this emerging narrative of Cascadia? And do you see any potential there for reformulation of settler indigenous relations?
I'm giving some sort of talk at a geography conference in a few weeks called Decolonizing Cascadia, and I didn't even really know what they're talking about. So I have to just be ignorant, but hopefully I'll learn lots at that conference.
Hi, I have an invitation and a question. Today is Earth Fest at the Student Union Building, and everybody's invited. It's a symposium. There's at 5:30 there's a free meal, and at 7 it's open mic. So there's a really opportunity for expression. We talk about sustainability, activism, peace, rights, identity, recognition, empowerment, grassroots action, and freedom. And my question is, what more can students like us do locally at the Student Union Building and beyond?
It's a good question. I'm always stumped by seemingly simple ones. I think first that we have to, I think that it's a matter of establishing relationships of like reconciliation in the true sense of support and solidarity for Indigenous people's struggles, whether or not they're in institutions like the university or in relationship to the reclamations of their territories. So there has to be some tangible demonstration of support for those struggles. Might seem kind of a simple way, but that's what this process is about. And that is what, if there's anything that's going to that is going to indicate a success and a subsiding of this pent-up outrage and resentment, is going to be demonstrating that in deeds. Because in the way in which I framed it, it's like these reactive emotions are indeed reactive insofar as they're reacting to something, and that's these injustices that are being perpetrated on the ground every day. So once those begin to subside, you can expect people to be alive in a more healthy relationship to themselves and with you and with others.
Thank you.
What place is there for the rage of Indigenous women who experience colonial violence and sexualized violence through this colonial structure? How can their unique rage play a part in this decolonizing process?
They're probably playing the most effective part and have been most expressive. Theoretically, I've been using Fanon, but the most influential, although they don't talk about resentment so much, they talk about politicized and creative articulations of rage, outrage, and anger, have been feminists of color and Indigenous women. So the work of like Lee Miracle, the poet Christos has this excellent, very long poem called "They're Always Telling Me I'm Too Angry," and then Black feminists such as Audre Lorde and feminists of color like Sarah Hott. So theoretically and creatively, in terms of artistic and cultural production, they're at the fore in community struggles. On the ground, though, they're also at the fore. So if you look at the outrage, and in talking with Rita last night, the coupling of outrage, anger, but also love, the organizing year-round that has to go into organizing women's memorial marches every 14th of February for the past decade plus, is the types of exactly, actually, not the types of, exactly the types of rage and praxis that I'm talking about. So thank you for that comment.
So on the one hand, we have certain state logic that allows the nationhood but under the state's sovereignty. And on the other hand, you are talking about this transformation of subjectivity. Can this subjectivity be transformed even while it's participating in the state, like processes like the TRC, the land claims processes that already undermine the sovereignty of Indigenous nations?
I'm not saying that they can't outright, but the point is it's not going to work in the long term because they are undermining or built on relations that are hostile to Indigenous ways of life. So even if you're able to etch out some sort of moment of sanctuary or reprieve from it, you've left intact the entire field of social relations that are structurally geared towards the destruction of those subjectivities and ways of life. So it's not a matter of whether or not it can happen in an instance, but whether or not it will have the ongoing effect over time, which I don't think it will.
Was there a more strategic reason why you didn't choose the term anger or being angry over resentment?
I sometimes speak of them as very related, as philosophers of emotions do. I tried to point out at the beginning that what is interesting to me about resentment is that it is often, or at one point in time, it was generally recognized as a politicized emotion, in that it is identifying a harm or wrongdoing, which anger doesn't have to. Like you can be angry by being stung by a bee 10 times, but to be resentful over it kind of doesn't make a lot of sense. Because it's not a person, well, I guess you could think it's an injustice, but then you'd be crazy. So there's that reason. Like I wanted to talk about resentment because it is an explicitly politicized form or emotion related very closely to anger. The second thing is that resentment, by definition, I didn't even know this. So for in the discourse on reconciliation, like the idea to forgive, which has been very tightly wound into reconciliation discourse, is when you're reading philosophers' emotions, they go through very, very deep, like specific. They make sure they know what they're talking about. To forgive is actually to willfully relinquish resentment. Like that's built into the conceptual apparatus of the reconciliation approach, is by definition to relinquish this resentment, which becomes pathologized and so on. So resentment, even more so than anger, although they're very closely related, is more specific to the discourse of reconciliation and what the reconciliation industry, its paraphernalia, like commissioners and all these sorts of things, have targeted in need of transformation.
I study African politics, and so I was really excited to hear about the way you're using the Penon and the revitalization of Penon all throughout the sort of post-colonial world, I think. So I'm just wondering, and you brought up the South African case, I'm wondering how important you think it is to make those global connections in your work and in the practice of Indigenous people, so that it's not necessarily just a Canadian phenomenon, but you're connecting people here.
It is important, so I like to emphasize it, and at one point it was the norm rather than like an exception to the rule. What recognition has also done through the state, like the state sort of exchanges of recognition, in particular like with respect to land claims, for instance, has really kind of generated a parochial sense of self and our obligations to others among some First Nations. Like the harsh dividing of like, or the imposition of the mine or thine sort of lines that structure the entire land claims process has cut off our senses of belonging and relations of reciprocity to others in the world. So we get into a mentality that if you have your land claim up and running or some sort of self-government, and you have come to fool yourself that non-renewable resource development is something that you'll have some substantive control over, and then somebody says, yeah, but the pipeline will also go through our territory, and you're like, well, it is good for us. That's a very recent phenomenon in the way in which Indigenous peoples, First Nations, have kind of come to think about their identities to others. You go back prior to the land claims, like, and I'll just speak from what I've come to learn about my own history, and these connections were never fabricated or constructed in these very narrow kind of in these cylinders. They were very expansive. So when we said we didn't want a pipeline in the 1960s, we didn't say that it was because it would be bad for us, although it would be. We said that it would be bad for everybody, including the poor people who Shell also invests in and is destroying their lives in that period. We're not going to have a pipeline on our land because we have obligations to them as much as we do to our neighbors. That has started to break down, and unfortunately, though, I see it starting to build up again, interestingly, over questions of pipelines again, because they're not containable within those parochial spaces, identities constructed around claims and nationhood in those very narrow ways of understanding. Sorry.
I wanted to just return to what you said, the kind of organizing around the Women's Memorial March and the example. I guess I just wanted to ask that, I think I wonder, a lot of the memorial marches are also very past oriented, so they're about remembering, which is very important to do, but I don't necessarily see them, a lot of what happens through those processes of remembering can shut out voices, for example, of sex workers, Indigenous women who are in Canada today, so it's other people speaking for the lost instead of the people who are there today looking forward or having a place, a renewed place in our communities in the future or right now. So I'm wondering how, within that, those movements that are kind of past oriented, how do we shift that to more beyond what happens next or where we are, how we're moving forward? Because I think there's a lot of silencing that happens in that past for people listening to remember.
I would have to answer very cautiously and tentatively, because I'm starting to look into this as an example. Like, people always be like, "What's your examples?" And this is one that I think is, from my understanding so far, an important one. And it just kind of surprises me that to hear a critique of it as being kind of past oriented, because just from my own knowledge and experience, I haven't seen that. It's always kind of to identify an ongoing harm in the presence that needs to stop as a condition of possibility for anything productive or healthy or transformative. So I'd have to look into it more, because I haven't heard. I'd probably talk with you more in order to understand more of the past. It's the overemphasis on the past and how it can exclude in the present. My other thing would be, and this is just more generally, is that I don't think we can actually, we can be attentive to these sorts of exclusions or try and maintain a certain sort of vigilance in anticipating where our conduct might affect it in that sort of way. But I don't think that we can guarantee that it'll never happen. So we also just have to be kind of reflexive to being called to account when those have been identified, those forms of oppressive or exclusionary practices we've been called on. So again, a messy answer, but Charles.
So does the politics of Gentleman favor kind of an agonistic politics? If you think about the way that Gentleman or even the Bow talks about it, in terms of the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities, but also to a certain extent, because that the Gentleman will play out within Indigenous communities, that it favors a certain kind of agonism is there as well. And I guess if that follows from that, then the question becomes, so what do we do now with the sort of principle of consensus or modified consensus, which is also an Indigenous ethic? Where does that play out?
I don't know whether or not it does, but I know because I just started thinking about this recently, and I'm building it into a little bit what is a nerdy answer, but like the idea that Fanon kind of draws us to this oppositional politics that is born of resentment and crystallizes into a friend-enemy, adversary-foe, or foe, adversary, ally, colonizer-colonized binary. When that crystallizes, that friend-enemy relationship, that's the condition of possibility of breaking and transcending it into some perhaps authentic mutual relationship of reciprocity and recognition. So it's not like the agonistic interpretation of Schmidt's friend-enemy as being constitutive of the political. is very different in that sort of way. Whether or not like where it goes, what I'm thinking, I don't think it would be generally recognizable as a kind of an agonistic approach as we've come to understand in the literature. Or?
As a recent graduate of the education program at UVic, how do you think our education system is doing as far as closing these gaps in elementary schools, high schools? Is it good, bad, or needs a lot of work?
It's not good. I just have some more personal anecdote. One of the prompting, kind of when I started to theoretically and politically start to think more about anger and resentment, came out of a pedagogical moment in the classroom where a white student kind of refused to listen to what Tag Alfred's work kind of throws on our laps because of the urgency in which it was expressed. And that got me to think, well, that's strange, because you'll listen to some non-native scholars saying just as critical stuff, but they're presenting it in a more conciliatory sort of way. So I started to, that's when I kind of came across as a teaching tool, opening the course with that poem by Christos and with the uses of anger by Audre Lorde. And then I just kind of was like, hey, you already know a lot about Fanon, and he speaks to this too. So it was actually in an educational context, or a deficiency, that led me to think about these things more in terms of my research and writing.
Hey, so again, I don't want to speak long enough about this, but thank you for coming here and helping me continue to honor racism and people in my mind. So I was thinking for that. My question is that what strengths, weaknesses, limitations, or assumptions do you see with Indigenous people joining forces with environmentalists to help advance decolonization?
I think that those relations are obviously necessary, but they're often too instrumental, or they're conceived of in an instrumental sort of way. So, environment, from my understanding, and this is kind of from reading it historically, is that these relationships will be forged, or have been historically kind of tended to be forged or linked with First Nations insofar as First Nations were acting like they were supposed to be perceived to be acting by environmentalists. So it's not dependent on any substantive notion of decolonization, Indigenous sovereignty, and so on. But as an Indigenous person who would want to call to account our own activities in relationship to the natural world, that our leaders and people who are now willfully participating in its degradation also have to be held to account, and we can do that through our relationship building and alliances with decolonial, environmental type institutions.
Hi. So yeah, I have a question. My question is like, well, I think it's really like sort of natural for people to make the connections between what you're talking about is resentment in terms of Indigenous resurgence, more about like the direct action kind of side of things. But then, like within that Indigenous resurgence paradigm, there's also the role of cultural revitalization that I think people don't necessarily think about as quickly or on the same level as the direct action side of things. So maybe can you speak a little bit about that and how like this, how resentment plays into the cultural revitalization sort of aspect of resurgence?
Yeah, a direct action, like the forceful assertion of one's kind of is a cultural act, a resurgence act. It's living those relationships that you have to the land and demonstrating them through direct action. So I think if it sounds like they're distinct, or people think of them as kind of two different kinds of things, it's just we have to rethink that, because it isn't. Interestingly though, and this is to get slightly nerdy again, is that that Fanon saw negritude as ultimate, as being steeped in resentment. Like he explicitly says so, but he also sees it as absolutely foundational and necessary to this process of what we might today call resurgence, although I discussed with you why Fanon goes there. But it's absolutely key. The reaction to the degradation of your being as degenerate by affirming its worth is resentment in phenomenon. Like it's a reaction. How that, or whether or not he saw those cultural affirmations translate into action, I think, is what our work is more than it was, or was conceived of as back then.
How do you think it's the best way to keep that resentment and rage directed towards opposing structures and not each other?
Yeah, that's the question. And I've been again, I tried to doing this, talking about it is one way of kind of giving us some clarity on what's going on and how we conceive of what's going on in our communities. But that seems like too little an intervention. I have done it, or am doing it by kind of, in my work at least, by showing examples, or talking about examples of what I'm talking about. Like this is when we seem to be directing or channeling or expressing this correctly, or in ways that seem to be potentially very transformative. And this is when we're not, when it goes inward and explodes outward in lateral violence, or family violence, or violence against women, or all these violences, and exposing those for their harm. But again, it's like the other answer. I don't think that none of this is with guarantees. We just have to be vigilant in keeping our eye open for that, both the good and the bad.
I'm struggling to, I find your ideas exciting, but I'm struggling to understand how they explain or how they can apply to the realities of the super marginalized who live in the inner city. Social inequities are increasing, and people who get drawn into the inner city, their lives are hyper-regulated by all kinds of institutions, and many of them don't have links to their home communities, reserves, and dams. And expressions of resentment or anger are immediately sanctioned in terms of perhaps in interface with institutions. And I'm just struggling. There are so many people who try to speak for the disenfranchised, and yet continually kind of co-opt their bio resources and their stories, and it's a form of re-marginalization. I'm just really stuck as to how to take this, or how to apply these ideas among a group who are so marginalized and yet exemplify exactly what we're talking about.
Don't quite I think it's entirely relevant for what you just said, is because these expressions and then the activities that come out of them. Like say the downtown east side of Vancouver. It's a simmering explosion of resentment and political activity, the best that there is in the city. There's also very evident when it can turn destructive there as well. So I think it's evident that these articulations of anger and resentment, when they're being cashed out in really innovative political activity, whether around as the organizing for Women's Memorial March, or whether it's the Power of Women group and their anti-colonial gentrification housing struggles. These sorts of things seem to be generated by being very angry and and resentful of the conditions that have been structurally placed or that created those. So it seems to me that it's very, very relevant to that context. And then the other way is like in the way in which you like mentioned the kind of channeling and co-opting this, like that's what recognition does, is in my claim or in the larger work, is that it purposefully kind of contains and co-opts these demands and claims and struggles in ways that actually serve to entrench prevailing relations of power rather than transform them.
Well, this is inspired by the last question, because, and I don't want to put words in a person's mouth when you ask it, but so it's just inspired. So using resentment and emotions in the way that you're discussing it is very attractive, because in part it gets us away from a very problematic, the problematic constraints of sort of rational argument and a kind of a tradition in Western theory and argumentation that is all about what is rational. But that leads me to my question, which is, I think that's why people who speak as you are about emotion have so much to teach us. But on the other hand, if the game is about distinguishing between justified resentment and unjustified resentment, then I start thinking, well, this is the same conversation about rationality, where the people in the downtown east side or whatever vulnerable people are, where their resentment and their anger is destructive. There's someone drawing that line, and that's exactly what makes it, us look to people like John Rawls and the Kantians and say, let's talk about rationality, because there we can actually have arguments, where with emotion it's very difficult.
No, and that's what, and when John Rawls in the Theory of Justice mentions or describes resentment as a moral feeling, the next sentence is it's, in such instances, it's the demand is on those who experience that subjective state to articulate to identify and articulate reasons against the injustice itself through the exchange. And I'm not that, obviously, but so and I've been trying to think about, like, on this question of what's a reasonable or unreasonable expression of resentment, and it's a real difficult one, partially, and there's a philosopher at York who's written this article called Unreasonable Resentments, is one of the inherently messy terrain of this kind of critical engagement with the political import of emotion is that in particular, one of the characteristics of resentment is that it often is, the way in which they frame it is like, it's not often honest with itself. It doesn't identify itself as relating to some harm or injustice or form of oppression. That's why it's so like simmering, and it doesn't get released into rage or kind of a different form of anger. So I really think that the question is an important one, and I'm still working on how do you kind of, because we do have to evaluate in order to distinguish the resentment that I want to kind of validate to a certain extent here versus the one that Corey mentions about the resenting, the comment writer after a National Post article on land titles. He's done. So what's wrong with them? Which one's righteous and which one's not? I'm not the type that will kind of probably turn to well, I know I won't. A Rawlsian justification or a Habermasian justification for that, but probably more look at it in terms of like what are the effects that these emotions are having in the world and on those social relationships. So perhaps a more kind of a Foucauldian approach.
Yeah.
For you and the many others that I'm sure have questions,
I'll be around.
Glen's going to stick around, but we actually have to finish our official event here. And I'm going to finish off by first acknowledging the work of our staff, Mick and Ange, for putting the series together. For his excellent talk, always challenging, thought-provoking, and dare I say, unsettling. And with that, I have a handshake, and I have something that's going to make a lot of people jealous here. Brand new IGOV hoodie. There's some other things in the bag. But with that, thank you all for coming. Excellent questions, excellent discussion, and we'll look forward to seeing you all at our next event. Thank you very much.